So these soldiers take the field in late February and discover to their great surprise that the North Country gets really, really cold in the wintertime. In fact, General Crook was the first to engage, stationed at Fort Fetterman down there at the bottom, and departing from the fort on March 1st, he and about 700 men started marching northward, and it was so cold that the temperatures were so low that the thermometers that they had with them couldn't even measure it. It went lower than their thermometers did. In fact, when they would make camp, the soldiers had to take their forks and put them on the hot coals of the fire for a few minutes before they could use them. Otherwise, the metal on the forks would freeze to their tongue. So I'd hate to be the first person that found out that was a problem. Anyway, this is in March, and in January they had expected, though they hadn't really expected, all those Lakotas to travel in weather like that to make their way back for that meeting that was held on short notice. Anyway, they head north, and you'll see they pass by a couple of other forts, Fort Reno and Fort Phil Kearny, both of which say ruins next to them. These are two of the three forts, the third one being Fort C.F. Smith over the border in Montana, that had been built along the old Bozeman Trail that is part of the agreement in the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, the Army had agreed to abandon. So I would imagine that was kind of eerie in the dead of winter, in the howling wind and blowing snow, going by the ruins of these abandoned forts. Eventually, they made their way up into what is now Montana along the Tongue River, and their scouts saw two Native American warriors whom they identified as Ogallala Sioux. And so Crook decided to divide his forces. They took off in pursuit, not really in pursuit, they were tracking those two Indians. And as they got to the Powder River, Crook decided to send Colonel Reynolds, who was under his command, with the majority of the force to attack, to find the village that those two warriors had come from and attack it. And Crook stayed behind with about 300 men, so Reynolds had almost 400. And so off they set to try to find this village, and they located the general vicinity of it and started drawing up plans to make an attack. The village was along the west bank of the Powder River, which was frozen solid at that time. Here is a contemporary 21st century modern photograph of the site viewed from the south looking to the north, with a white triangle there representing the location of the village. The scouts had been correct that they were Ogallala Sioux they had seen, and the assumption was therefore made this was an Ogallala village, but it was not. It was actually a northern Cheyenne village with a handful of Ogallala visiting, led by, they were members of the Soreback Band, led by He Dog, who had recently gotten married, by the way, had his new wife with him, and several members of his family that had just come basically passing through on their way to the Ogallala camps to visit with the Cheyenne. In fact, there were 50 or 60 lodges in the village, and around 8 of them were the visiting Lakota. Okay, the picture on the right is kind of a zoomed out picture. It is not the same location. It's a different part of the river. But I just wanted to show you what the topography is like on a larger scale. So you'll see, picture on the left, the land's pretty flat there along the banks of the river. But as you go farther away from the river, then it rises first into bluffs and then into a very steep mountainous area. The river has over time cut its way deep into that. So bear that in mind. When the force commanded by the colonel arrives, they're going to have to descend down these steep bluffs to get to the village. Now, they had not only been mistaken in what kind of village it was, although they really didn't care because they were after the Lakota and the Cheyenne, the Lakota allies as well. Well, some of those mistakes are going to be a lot more impactful than just knowing which group of Indians you're fighting. The picture on the left is what Reynolds planned to do. All right, so the circled area is where they thought the village was. And so he divided his force, which was 6 companies, into 3 battalions of 2 companies each. And they were separated, and they were going to come from different directions. The plan was the battalion there on the bottom to the south was going to go straight into the village, attacking them. Then the battalion in the middle was going to come up, come at them directly from the west, reinforcing that 1st battalion. The 3rd battalion on top there to the north, they were going to skirt around the village and head upriver just a little bit and seize control of these bluffs. That's the darker orange areas at the base of the mountains. So they were going to get up into those bluffs so that they could fire down on any Indians who escaped from the village that was being attacked and tried to run away north along the river. So that was the plan, but there was only one problem. That's not where the village was. The village was actually about 1 mile to the north. So those bottom 2 battalions got there, and there was no village there. A little bit farther, though, up the river to the north, there was the pony herd, containing about 1,000 horses. And they were able to capture about 700 of the Indians' horses. Meanwhile, that 3rd battalion, who was supposed to get up in there and hold the bluffs, they're headed north to do that, and they see the village. Well, one of the 2 companies does. They actually got separated. The 2nd company was slow in following behind because they had misjudged how difficult the terrain would be in winter. So essentially, it is just 1 company out of the 6 that stumbles upon the village and rushes in to attack it. So they come in, making their attack, and the warriors gather together, the women and children and old people, and flee northward to get them to safety. And then the warriors immediately turn back southward, and they actually seize, as you can see up there in the upper left of the 2nd picture, the warriors, the Cheyenne and their Ogallala visitors, they managed to seize the bluffs, so they're able to fire down on the soldiers who were there ransacking the village. And as they're doing that, eventually the other soldiers make their way up and join in. Well, there's not much to attack in the village because almost everyone's gone, and are now firing on them from the hills. However, Colonel Reynolds gives the order to destroy the village, to destroy everything in it, so that it cannot be used by the Indians. And like with other cases we have discussed, that was a lot of their winter provisions, a lot of the meat they had stored up to last them, and a lot of their possessions, their robes, their buffalo robes, their blankets, because they had fled so quickly out of necessity. They had to leave that stuff behind. So the soldiers were ordered to burn that stuff. The soldiers, who were freezing to death, 66 of them had frostbite, and who were half-starved because they hadn't brought enough provisions, were ordered to destroy the buffalo robes and blankets and the meat. Now, a few of them managed to pilfer a buffalo robe or two for use later on, but that was not that was against orders, and for the most part, that stuff was destroyed. Meanwhile, another group of Cheyenne from that village had been returning from the east, where they had been hunting. And so they hear the gunfire and they come up, and you can see that red arrow pointing downward to the far right. They get there and they also start firing on the soldiers, and some of them slip down the river and go back to the pony herd, where Reynolds had forgot to order anyone to stand guard over these 700 stolen horses, and the Cheyennes steal 500 of them back. Finally, after 5 hours in the howling wind and blowing snow and taking shots at one another, Reynolds orders his men to withdraw. Now, the Indian women and children and old people made their way to the village of Crazy Horse, but that was a 3-day walk away through that weather, and quite a few of the women and children and old people froze to death or died of exposure along the way. Now, so far as the actual battle itself, there weren't that many casualties. There were 4 soldiers killed and 6 wounded. There were 3 Indians killed, 2 Cheyenne and 1 Lakota, and 2 wounded. Of the 4 soldiers who were killed, 3 of them were, killed dead in their tracks, shot down. The 4th one was wounded, I think, in the hip, and so he wasn't mobile. And when Reynolds ordered his men to withdraw, retreating from the enemy fire, they did not retrieve the 3 dead bodies, and they didn't even retrieve the wounded guy, who the Cheyenne got a hold of and cut into pieces. So that was capping off a very bad day for him. So this was the first engagement between the U.S. Army and the Lakota and Cheyenne in the Great Sioux War of 1876. And it wasn't really that auspicious a beginning. When Reynolds rejoined Crook south of the village, they then made their way back down to Fort Fetterman, had a couple of minor skirmishes along the way. And then when they returned to the fort, General Crook had Colonel Reynolds court-martialed for dereliction of duty and gross incompetence for several things. Number one, for not having his entire command come in together at the same time to attack the Indians, so that only 1/6 of his men initially attacked them, leaving them vulnerable. Number 2, burning that stuff that the soldiers really could have used. And then number 3, losing all those horses they had just captured. Well, they didn't lose all of them. They only lost, 5/7 of them. So he was actually found guilty in his court-martial, and he was sentenced to a 1-year suspension from his rank and from command and from active duty. Fortunately for him, he had a good friend from his early days in the Mexican-American War, who was now president, U.S. Grant, who granted him a reprieve. But nonetheless, at the end of a year, Reynolds just retired. So he is one of those colonels who did not go on to become a general again. Again, he had been a general. He'd been one of Grant's generals during the Civil War, but it was one of those brevet rank things that had been reduced. So There was the first battle. A couple of results from this initial attack, unprovoked attack, really, by the U.S. Army on this village. For one thing, there were a sizable minority of Lakotas who were out there in the unceded lands who had been talking about going back onto the reservation. That's what the government did. They wanted to negotiate. They had been talking about, well, maybe we'll go in then when the weather gets better in early spring and we can travel. Well, they're not going to do that now. In fact, there were quite a few people who were on the reservation who left and came out and joined the ones who were in the unceded lands. Second thing, the Cheyenne. They probably would have acted in support of their Lakota allies anyhow, but the fact that they weren't even involved in these discussions and the U.S. Army attacked one of their villages really ticked them off and even more firmly cemented the idea that they were going to be resisting along with their allies. The United States Army thereupon decided, hey, let's wait till it gets warmer to do this again. So they planned their next offensive for June. Meanwhile, when spring arrived, upwards of 300 or more Crow and Shoshone offered their services to General Crook. They were at war with the Lakota and Cheyenne already, farther to the west, and had been for a very long time. There were also about 100 Pawnee scouts. The Pawnee had also been at war with the Lakota and Cheyenne for a very long time, and in more recent memory, in 1873, a group of Ogallala and Brule Lakotas had attacked a group of Pawnee who were on a hunting trip in Nebraska and killed 156 people at a place called Massacre Canyon. So they were happy to go help kill some Lakota. And the Arikara as well, traditional enemies of the Lakota, including Bloody Knife, who had long been Custer's favorite scout and someone he described as his friend, even though Custer, who's pictured here sitting down, had on one occasion during the Black Hills expedition in 1874 he had gone into a mad fury and actually shot at Bloody Knife, but they forgave each other. Custer actually had about 40 Arikara scouts with him. So sometimes people will say they will note how ironic it is that the native peoples were divided among themselves, with some of them on the side of the U.S. of the whites. But it is necessary to remember that there were long-standing enmities between some of these tribes, and the enmity between the Crows and the Lakotas would continue for a very long time. When the summer campaign began in June 1876, the plan was to have the army divided into 3 columns, each approaching from a different direction. The Dakota Column, as it was called, commanded by General Terry, coming out of Fort Abraham Lincoln near what is now Bismarck, North Dakota. That included Custer's 7th Cavalry. Then there was the Montana Column, commanded by Colonel Gibbon, coming out of Fort Ellis near Bozeman, Montana. And there was the Wyoming Column, commanded by General Crook, coming out of Fort Fetterman. The plan was to converge together and catch the Lakotas and Cheyennes in a pincher, to converge on them from 3 different directions at once. Now, as promised earlier, here are the major leaders on the Native American side in the Great Sioux War, which was also a Great Cheyenne War. On the top row, you've got Lakota leaders, all of whom we've previously discussed. In fact, the first four, we've seen their pictures before. You've got from the Hunkpapa Sitting Bull, of course, but also Gall and Rain in the Face. Gall, by the way, led raids in the late 1860s, early 1870s against the Arikara that killed Bloody Knife's two brothers and later his son, which was part of the reason that he hated Gall and the Lakota so much. Anyway, then you've got Crazy Horse of the Ogallala and his cousin, Touch the Clouds, who is Minneconjou. He got his name from the fact that he was a tall fella. He was the youngest son of Lone Horn, the really elderly guy who had gone to Washington a couple of years or a year before all this happened. His older brother, Spotted Elk, alias Bigfoot, supported the war, but did not engage in any of the fighting physically. On the bottom, you've got some of the Cheyenne leaders. You've got Two Moons, and it was actually his village on the Powder River that Colonel Reynolds had attacked. And you've also got Little Wolf, whose name is actually mistranslated into English. It should be Little Coyote, but Little Wolf is how he's known in the history books. And similarly with this other fellow, Morning Star, which is his actual Cheyenne name, but his Lakota friends gave him the name Dull Knife, and that's how he tends to be known in the history books as well. So beyond the Great Sioux War, we'll be talking about Little Wolf and Morning Star, Dull Knife in particular, in a different context a little later on. And here are some Lakota leaders, all of whom we have talked about before, who were, well, quote-unquote, agency Indians, who remained on the agency and who were opposed to the idea of going to war, despite the fact that all of them had military experience, specifically even against the United States. But Red Cloud there and Spotted Tail, you'll recall, had, along with Lone Horn, gone up and met with President Grant, whom they had met with several times before. And even before that, back in the war in the 1860s, Red Cloud's War, obviously Red Cloud was involved in that on the fighting against the U.S. side, as were American Horse, alias Washichu Tashunka, which really is more accurately translated, White Man's Horse, and Young Man Afraid of His Horses, also mistranslated. It should be something more along the lines of his horses are fear-inspiring. But the three of them, Red Cloud, American Horse, and Young Man Afraid of His Horses, had been involved in wrapping up that Red Cloud War and signing the peace treaty there in 1868. By the way, I forgot to mention when I was talking about the leaders on the war side in the previous picture that Morning Star, alias Dull Knife, had been present at the signing of the first treaty of Fort Laramie way back in 1851. By June of 1876, the numbers of native people in the region had swelled, as when the weather improved, even more Lakotas left the Great Sioux Reservation to go and join their relatives in rebellion. Numbers of Cheyenne grew and some Arapaho, to the extent that by that June, there were 3,000 to 4,000 warriors, with perhaps 5,000 or so non-fighting age people, women, children, old people, and so forth. So 3,000 to 4,000 warriors. To compare the three columns of the U.S. Army that were entering into operation in the region at the same time, had about 2,500 troops, 2,500, plus several hundred scouts, the majority of whom were Native Americans, so 3,000 or so. 3,000 or so on the side of the U.S. Army, 3,000 to 4,000 on the side of the quote-unquote hostile Indians. Well, Sitting Bull had announced that he was going to do a sun dance to seek a vision for guidance. Now, by this point, he had become the most influential of all the leaders involved, in large part because not only did he have a good strategic mind, but he was also a deeply spiritual person and was, in fact, a medicine man. And, Native people put a lot more trust in that even than they did military skill. So he announced that he was going to do a sun dance, and many, many bands came together to be a part of that whole ceremony and that whole atmosphere, so that there were just huge numbers. The majority of the Native people in the area were present. It was like, well, if you've ever been to a powwow, it was almost like a big powwow atmosphere with people from different allied tribes mingling together. And then Sitting Bull did, in fact, do the sun dance, where he hung suspended and went without food or water for 2 days, and cut his 2 arms repeatedly to speed along the process of physical privation, to bring about the right mental and spiritual attitude to be receptive to a vision. And when he was cut down, he reported that he had such a vision. In his vision, he had seen hundreds of blue-coated soldiers falling from the sky, head first, like a swarm of grasshoppers all over the ground, dead. And he said that a voice had told him, "I give these to you because they have no ears." Well, this was obviously interpreted as an omen for a great victory over the white people who just wouldn't listen. So, to use a more modern parlance, the folks there got really jazzed up about all this. They got very, very energized and became very confident. On June 15th, General Crook set out once more from Fort Fetterman, headed north in search of hostiles. He had about 950 troops with him, about 100 scouts. He did not have Colonel Reynolds, of course. He also was accompanied by some of those Shoshone and Crow who had come and offered their services, including two of the great leaders from each tribe. Washakie of the Shoshone, who had 86 warriors with him, and Plenty-Coup of the Crow, who had 175 with him. Both of these chiefs had very storied careers. Washakie was a little bit older than Plenty-Coup, who had a storied career yet ahead of him. Plenty-Coup, by the way, much like Sitting Bull, was a mystic in addition to being a strategist. So they head north, hoping to find some enemies to fight. Crook had his men getting up at 3 a.m. to start their march, and had them marching double time all day, so they were pretty exhausted after a couple of days. He was hoping that they would be able to find the Lakota and Cheyenne and sneak up on them, but that was sort of messed up by the Shoshones and Crow, who came across some buffalo and started shooting them. So Crook was afraid they may have given away their advance with the sound of the gunfire. And in fact, they had. A force led by Crazy Horse came looking for them, actually. with about at least 1,000 warriors, some estimates as high as 1,800, but fairly evenly matched, really, roughly around the same number. Now, Crook had his men stop for the night and hadn't really posted a heavy guard. They all just kind of dropped where they fell because they were exhausted. And it was the Shoshones and Crows who actually kept watch. And it's a good thing because they were able to detect the enemy. They came running into the camp yelling, Lakota, Lakota. And so they started the fight. The Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapahoes versus the Shoshones and Crows. And that gave enough time for Crook to get his men up and organized and ready to join in the fight. Whereas most Native American attacks traditionally had been guerrilla actions or really quick strikes and then quick withdrawals coming kind of in spurts or in waves, this time, under Crazy Horse, they just kept coming. The fighting lasted for hours with very little let up. General Crook assumed, incorrectly, that there must be a village, a large village, very close by, because that's the only reason he could imagine that these Indians would be fighting so hard. Although the fact is they were fighting because they had been inspired and encouraged by Sitting Bull's vision, and they were just really ticked off. That helped too. Crook was fortunate that he had his Indian allies who had bought him some time. Otherwise, if they hadn't been there, the Lakotas and Cheyenne would have just swept through the camp, and it probably would have been a wholesale slaughter. As it was, there weren't a whole lot of casualties on either side. This happened along the Rosebud Creek, which is where this battle gets its name, the Battle of the Rosebud. Except among the Cheyenne, there's a different name for it, due to an incident that occurred during the battle when a Cheyenne warrior named Comes in Sight had his horse shot from under him, and so he was thrown off the horse and in danger of being killed when, from out of nowhere, came his sister, galloping on her own horse. Her name was Buffalo Calf Road Woman, and she rode up to him and scooped him up behind her on the horse and escaped, saving his life. And this impressed all the other Cheyenne so much that they called this battle the fight where the girl saved her brother. Crook called it a victory because he was still there in the roughly same spot when the fight was over, but it wasn't really a victory for him at all. They had been thoroughly chastised and embarrassed by their opponents. Crook then withdrew, made camp, and sent word that he needed reinforcements, and he didn't make too many more moves for a while after that. So the next part of the action, Crook won't be in because he and his men will be sitting there waiting for reinforcements. The Shoshones and Crows went home after this. Coming up next, Custer's A Very Bad Day.